Namaste everyone, welcome to the second of our talks leading up to the International Day of Yoga on 21 June. I'm Jayanti Gupta of the Integrated Cultures and Integrated Women's Network. We have had the support of the High Commission of India, so deeply grateful to them. They have put up the flyers on their Facebook page, so if you have time to take a look and give a like. I would also like to express my gratitude to all the yoga teachers, the speakers. They have given their wholehearted support, and many of them are joining this talk today. I think it will be a cliche, but nevertheless true to say that Alan Goode doesn't require an introduction. Many people in the yoga world and outside know about him. He's the director of Yoga Mandir. Alan holds a junior advanced teaching certificate issued by the BKS Iyengar and has studied regularly in Pune, India with the Iyengar family for close to 40 years. Alan started practicing yoga in 1975 in Sydney and commenced teaching in 1982. He has extensive experience in teaching Iyengar yoga to all levels of students, from beginners through to experienced students, teachers, as well as those with injuries and medical conditions. Alan is passionately involved with the practice of yoga and its application to daily life. Through his writing, he unravels the themes of the Yoga Sutras and demonstrates their links to our daily practice. Yoga in the modern world is the topic for today, and Alan will introduce the topic. There are only 2 housekeeping rules. Please mute your audio. Alan's recording for me because I do a radio show and I would like to play this sometime on my radio. And the second is that we reserve all our questions till the end after Alan's talk. Namaste, Alan, and thank you.
Thank you, Jayanti. Thank you for the invitation and also to the High Commission of India for their support. Each year we have a program as part of the International Day of Yoga, and I'm happy to be part of that and to be able to contribute. Today, I thought with this talk, I wanted to start with a question. And to me, on one level, I'd say it's odd even to think of the question, but what is yoga? And partially I ask it because in the modern world, it seems to be presented as exercise, almost an alternative to going to the gym. And if I look in some circles, I see maybe it's about stress relief. It's about one's tensions. If we look on the internet, we see Instagram and we think it's all about the body. But Instagram is not the history of yoga, nor is it the subject. And I think even in my lifetime, in my practice life, I've seen yoga move from where it was when I started. Now it seems to be a commodity that is consumed and that has often, in my view, very little substance. What I want to do is just go back a little and think about the history of what's called Indic thought. What did yoga arise out of and what is its subject matter? And then I want to think a little bit about what it is as a practice. And then lastly, to reflect upon where we are now. The history of yoga is entwined with the history of India. And yet in itself, it's not Indian. It's about what it is to be a human being and what it is to be alive in the world. One of the things I often reflect on is when I read some of the classical literature of yoga, written often around 2,000 years ago, what I hear is something that seems to me issues of our time. It's not just about a historical point in time, and nor is it just about India. There are two major texts that underpin yoga. One of these is called the Yoga Sutras, again written about 2,000 years ago. And the second is a thing called the Bhagavad Gita. Now, some in this audience will know a lot about the Gita, maybe a lot about the sutras, and I understand that there'll be others and maybe they're just names. But when we look at these two books, these two records in time, the Yoga Sutras is it's not actually a story at all. It's just this series of short, terse statements. Classically, people learned to chant the sutras. And so an individual would learn these short statements in an invocation. And there's 196 of them. And so one would learn the sutras and a teacher would unpack their meaning. So it's actually quite difficult to make sense of just picking up a copy of the sutras. In contrast to this, the Bhagavad Gita does something very different. It's this rich, complex story, full of complexity, full of human drama. It's a story. The sutras, there's no storyline. It's just these dry statements. But the Gita is this complex interaction. And it revolves around a dialogue between two people, two men. One named Arjuna, who's struggling in his life. And as he struggles with the questions before him, he's talking to this second person, Krishna. And he outlines his struggle, his problems, and Krishna responds. And so essentially it's a dialogue. Krishna offers observations and ways to think about the problems that Arjuna is encountering. It's easy to read the text and say, this is about an event. But actually, as I'm characterizing it, it's actually a story that each person goes through. The issues that Arjuna confronts are different to the issues that you and I confront in our lives. Arjuna anguishes, and we do as well. There are times where we can't think of the best way to act. We don't know how to respond. We get full of fear. We get deluded at times. The reality of the story of the Bhagavad Gita is actually about a battle. And these two men sitting on a hill above the battlefield. And the anguish is that Arjuna himself is a warrior. His job is to fight. But he looks down on the battlefield, and what he sees in these two armies below him are his relatives, his teachers, the people he knows, he loves, and they're on opposing sides. And he says, I cannot go into this field of action. And he's anguishing over something, his feelings about the world. Krishna gives him advice and makes a number of statements. And one of the key statements is that the world outside of you and the world within you, you might see the world outside of you as the world, but suffering happens within an individual. Conflict happens within an individual. Now, I don't want to go on a long time with the Gita story. It's complex, there's a number of layers to it. But what I'm really noting is that the Bhagavad Gita is about the questions, not in specific form, but the questions that we as individuals confront in ourselves. When we have situations, when we have points in our lives that we find overwhelming, where we can't make clear decisions, we struggle. Whether it's the Gita or whether it's the Yoga Sutras, both these texts are talking about what it is to be a human being. They both recognize that as human beings, we suffer, we struggle. We're not always clear. We're not always calm. I think about the Yoga Sutras, I think about the Bhagavad Gita, and I think about our time. This last year, we've experienced tremendous, it's like upheaval. The world has been being turned upside down. Many of the things that we relied upon, that we thought was stable in our lives, that we understood as either something that was unchanging or even our right to have, these things got swept aside. I think about when COVID hit, that the questions, the lockdowns, the suffering that individuals go through. And I think about yoga. I know there are specifics about the lockdown. There are things that happen in individuals' lives. Some people lost their livelihood. Some people changed their livelihood. Some people found the things they relied on were lost. And I see that parallel between what went on and continues to go on in the COVID and the story of the Gita. I, like most people, felt the pressure and the uncertainty. And yet, for me, what helped me live through that period was yoga. The story of the Gita, the story of the sutras, is the story not just of a period of time, but the story of our lives. It said that the subject of yoga is the subject of the human condition. But yoga is not about a belief system. You don't believe in the Bhagavad Gita. You don't believe in the Yoga Sutras. What both of these texts, the proposition propose, is that it is through a practice that we find inner balance, that we find equilibrium, and we find a way to get through life's challenges. In the Yoga Sutras, it's generally characterized as go off and have a practice. Patanjali, who wrote the sutras, doesn't say it should be this specific thing or that specific thing. He says through a practice. The Gita, in slight contrast, but equally important, says make life your practice. And I often characterize these two as the distinction between the forest and the kitchen. The forest is a reference to stepping back from life. It references the history of monastic traditions. I go to the forest, I step out of life to reflect on life. And that's the sutras. Whether it's a monastery, whether it's a walk in the bush, whether it's spending time on an island, to step out of one's life and to reflect is what the sutras proposes. On the other hand, the Bhagavad Gita suggests that in your daily activities, you practice, whether it be cooking, whether it be cleaning, whether it be a work life or a home life, the practice of life to find poise and inner calm. And they're not in opposition, and they're not talking about different things. They're talking about exactly the same thing. And they're talking, in many ways, about the struggles that we've just gone through and continue to go through in this pandemic time. Patanjali says you should practice. As I noted earlier, not that you have to practice one particular way. He says, get yourself a practice. And if I characterize the qualities, it's better that it be regular, almost habitual. Every day I practice. And if you do apply yourself regularly, it becomes a ritual, something I often liken it to brushing one's teeth. You can brush your teeth or not. But then after some time, if you don't brush your teeth, you notice something feels just not quite complete or right. Have a practice. It may be a physical practice. It may be in the body. But it could be a practice of sitting quietly. There are many ways to conduct a practice, but it should be regular. A practice also provides a refuge from a busy life. It allows us to step away from life's challenges and turmoil. It's a place to put down things, to leave the world. And it's also a place beyond our roles and responsibilities. Regardless of its content, regardless of what you do in a practice, I often think of it as I step back. And the simple act of stepping back gives me perspective on the things that overwhelm me, that I get caught up in. Patanjali advocates for a practice, but he doesn't say you should practice. He doesn't merely say you should practice. He says it is the practice of dispassion, the practice of letting go of the dramas that we create, the dramas that unfold in our lives, much like Arjuna's situation. The events themselves, maybe you can't remove the events that happen, but you can affect how you respond. Patanjali talks about a practice of dispassion. Can I engage in my practice, staying calm, clear? Can I put down the drama? Yoga recognizes that we're often full of stories. We tell ourselves stories. We have ideas about what's going on in the world. We have ideas about what others' motivations are. The practice of yoga is the act of stepping back, not just from life, but it's the act of stepping back and looking at oneself. And a practice is the means by which you look at yourself. And when I sit with myself, when I reflect upon events in my life, when I look back, I often see that maybe in retrospect, I could have acted differently. Maybe there were other options. Maybe I could not see those things at the time. But with insight, with perspective, the world does look different. And yoga understands that we often lose that clarity in the drama of life. A practice is the means to look at oneself, to sit quietly and reflect on the stories that we tell ourselves. Yoga is very specific, and without going into detail, Patanjali talks about what are called the vrittis and the kleshas, the types of mental states and the types of afflictions that people suffer from. Examples would be that sometimes we're full of fear or full of desire and ambition, and that these things actually are the things that cause us suffering. Patanjali says it is through practice that we gain perspective, insight, clarity, and that we find within us a way to balance ourselves in order to be in the world. It's not an argument about stepping away, about removing oneself from life. Yoga is a practice that takes us into life and equips us for life. In the modern world, these days, and many of you have done possibly yoga long enough to have seen things before the era that we're in now. But these days I look at what goes under the name of yoga. where people teach in front of mirrors, where there's music, where it's just about movement, feeling good. And I think it's traveled a long way from the yoga that I learned, from not just its history, but the subject itself. Yoga as a subject says, stop, look at yourself, reflect upon your actions, reflect upon yourself and who you are. These days we see yoga as it's all about the body, all about yoga rooms and exercise classes. Most of us nowadays live sedentary lives. I think about that modern saying, what is it? That sitting is the new smoking. People now are dying from sitting down. And so these physical asanas are actually, in terms of a point in time, they are very relevant to our period of time. Relevant because most of us underuse our bodies. Most of us, I would say, are not in our bodies. And so the physical practice of asanas embodies the individual, changes their tensions, but also changes their physiology. But doing postures or asanas is not in itself doing yoga. Yoga is that reflective component, that learning to observe one's responses and reactions to things, to find that inner poise. The last year has been a challenge for everyone, and it's certainly not over. But I think all of us, many people, have found that in a period in which they could not move about freely, where their lives, routines were changed and lives were turned upside down, people started to think about what's important. To my mind, yoga, not just this sort of modern ideas of exercise, but yoga as a subject has more relevance today than ever before. And regardless of the type or the specific form of practice, it may be about postures, it may be about sitting meditation, it may be about giving one's time, volunteering or devotional practice, because all of these hold under the umbrella of yoga. But to my mind, yoga has greater relevance today than ever before. At a time of turmoil, confusion, we need to go into ourselves. We need to sit with ourselves, and we need the resources to do that. And from a practice can come that ability to respond to life's challenges, to seek clarity and calmness, and to meet life's challenges. This talk is really broad, and in some ways it's just a framing statement. Some weeks from now, I do another session in which I talk about yoga marga, the path of yoga, in which I hope to talk a little more about the physical, how a practice is done. My main purpose today was to think about, firstly, yoga not just has a history, but as a subject. Its history and the subject is bound up with the human condition. It's about how we are with the life we're in. It's not about something else. I have a busy life. I must do yoga to get away from it. It's about how to act in the world and how to be in the world. Yoga has relevance. Yoga is something that can speak to people of our time that need not have reference to its history, and yet an understanding of where it came from and what it's about changes the nature of your engagement. So thanks for being present. Thanks for listening. What I'll do is I'll offer anyone who'd like to ask a question, I'll just ask you to come in. So first of all, to unmute yourself and then to say your name, just can be first name, doesn't need to be, just so that we're all aware. And if we just do that systematically, I put a little time aside now if anyone would like to comment or have a question. I can read that as positive.
Shall I go first, Alan?
Yes.
Jayanti here. You drew from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali and from Gita. One is by a human being, and the other is from the mouth of God. So how do you draw a comparison between these two?
There's a long history in India of this discussion. If I personalize my response, and I say, for me, now I started yoga a long time ago, but there was no one in my family or in my circle who knew about yoga. So I started by accident. But it spoke to me, and it spoke to me on a very profound level. It spoke to me, and I would say, I was young, so I didn't understand the subject. I had not read anything, and I had no one I could talk to. But it spoke to me directly. It spoke to me, and I would say emotionally. I was able to be with myself and sit with myself in a way that I had not experienced. My life mostly teaching and practicing, has proved to me that there are threads that are common to all of us. And those threads, in a way, what I keep calling the human condition, whether via a God, for some, they will have belief in a God, what's an Ishvaric principle, a God, and others won't. But it is that experience of divinity in all of us that I think practice touches. And so I've never struggled over the various voices in the literature. For me, the literature only ever backed up my understanding from my practice. What I think yoga offers is the ability to come into contact with something inside yourself. And I call it a universal something, a spirit, a spirituality. And that transcends both race, culture, it transcends individuality. That in all of us sits an experience of something far greater than ourselves. So for me, in a way, I could say I'm not answering your question, but the reason I'm not answering is that for me, I never saw the practice as about the text itself or which text. I didn't start by reading, I started by practicing, and I have always had a teacher. Iyengar, who was my teacher, died only in 2014. But for all my life, I was taught, but not taught how to think, not taught what to think, but taught how to look into myself and how to sit with myself. For me, yoga as both a subject is highly personal, meaning it's about my inner world. And I think as a universal subject for everyone, it's about the individual. How one finds a way to live with yourself and in what ways you direct that or understand that is done by each individual. So maybe a little bit not elusive, but not answering your comment directly, but they are two different texts. And yet each of them I see as they talk to that same element within me. And when I sit with my students, when I, having taught for the period that I have, having watched so many people move through life, I see that they're talking to the same subject.
Thank you, Ellen. Last week, Robin also talked about something similar. It's really good to know you're on the same page, because she also said it's not about just about asanas or breathing. She talked about the 5 koshas.
Oh, yeah.
And the last, the Anandamaya, the state of bliss.
Now again, this would, different audiences maybe would say different things, meaning different contexts. But I always say, if there is one God in India, there's 108. There are many ways to find that part of ourselves, that divine part of ourselves. And yet the practice of yoga is meant to be a practice of integration, of finding wholeness in oneself, whether that's within a religion, within a belief system, or through a practice. Its aim, as you just said, through the koshas is one of integration. And that transcends all individual cultures. Now we have a chance for another question if someone, or comment. I mean, I'm happy for your comments as well. Maybe it's an observation from your experience or from your life.
Can I ask you a question, Alan? It's Katrina in Perth.
Yes, Katrina.
Alan, we talk a lot these days about the yoga being not simply a form of exercise, and that often in the modern world it's presented in this way. But I do wonder, in a holistic view of living in a modern, or indeed any society, if exercise itself doesn't play a part in that. And that for me, I first came to yoga through the body and through practicing. And although I have a field of study that is outside of my practice, I don't wonder whether, if we take a holistic view of asana inside of our lives, that there is some form of imperative for us to move and maintain healthy bodies. So I wonder if we don't downplay that a little much in this new world where we're sort of continually saying yoga is not about exercise. What do you think about that?
Good. Thanks. Question. Agree completely. I think the yoga does not make a distinction between body or mind. The body is the most visible expression of our consciousness, of our humanity. We now, and in some ways, absolutely as you just outlined, normally I would use my father as an example. In one generation, from my father to me, my father worked on a farm. He worked physically all his life. We moved to the city. He worked in factories, and on the weekend, he worked in building sites. He was, as a human being, he was active, he was vital, and in one generation, we are now, as I said earlier, in this concept of sitting is the new smoking. We recognize that when we do move, it's not just exercise, that actually we change our physiology, we change our mental state. You could argue, it is argued constantly, that exercise is mental health. Mind and body are not two things stuck together. We are one thing, one integrated human being. And when we fragment ourselves into these component parts, we do something that I think it's a little strange. But as you just said, whether you come through the body into yoga, it is the body-mind complex that is at play. And I'm often arguing that more than ever, it is now more relevant. If I use my body and if I apply myself in practice of asana, it's not exercise that helps me concentrate. The way I act changes, the very way I hold my mind, and it brings about this experience of stillness. My teacher, Iyengar, he highlighted, he said, what if I took asana? Now, I'll give you I'll praise you a quote, and some of you may have heard me do this before, because I think it's probably the most profound thing he ever said. Iyengar said, if Mahatma Gandhi could take two of the yamas, namely satya, truth, and non-violence, and through these he gained independence for India, why can I not take asana and through the practice of asana achieve the highest level of practice that yoga, highest level can achieve the qualities of yoga? Can I understand myself through a practice? What the practice is can vary. Iyengar, my teacher, focused through the lens of asana. And all I'm really noting is that there are many ways, the classic statement, there are many paths to God. And yet, as you say, if I say it personally, I have found that through asana, I have learned to focus. Through asana, I have developed meditative states in practice. Through asana, I am able, when I practice, to lose that I-centered focus, that self-centeredness. To me, the body is a vehicle to look at oneself and to integrate oneself. I think why you note that if we downplay the asanas, I think it's what I'm really doing, not downplaying, I'm just saying that oftentimes I think the subject gets lost in the modern world. We end up thinking asanas are about things, I usually joke about them as outfits. But asanas are much more than outfits. Asanas are a way to integrate oneself and a way to find some inner balance and peace. A regular practice of asana can change one's health, can change one's mental state, can change one's life. So I'd have to say I agree with you, and I certainly don't downplay asana.
Thank you for your clarity as always, Alan.
Narinder Grover here from Canberra, Alan. I really enjoyed your talk, very enlightening. One comment I have is that, say, I was about 22 years of age when I came to Australia to study, and that's about 50 years back. And I didn't have any exposure to yoga in India. Now I'm wondering if something can be taught to primary school kids in an interesting way that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. Something about yoga, something about integration of physical exercises, asanas, and integrated with mental health and fitness, which is so much needed these days in this, particularly in this age of pandemic and all the problems, but something that will stay with a person for the rest of their lives. Do you have any comment on that?
Yes. So thanks, Narinder, for the question. If I start very broad and I comment that I have people come into, so I teach in, I have a school and I teach in school. I have some people who come And maybe they come for a few months or a year and then they stop. And then often maybe I see them come back a year later. So sometimes people try, things go on in their lives, they get busy, they move away. But I've now been teaching long enough to say that often you influence something. The person may not be able to attend or continue to attend, but it does not mean that it has gone completely. And so the concept is you plant a seed. You plant a seed, and how it grows and when it grows can be very variable for an individual. With children, it's oftentimes when it's yoga is taught to children, it's taught as fun. And that's how we used to run classes when we were in the city, in Braddon. And we would teach them with drawing, with stories, with movement. As a person gets older, more mature, we start to focus on the way they hold their mind in asanas. As a subject, we say, can you plant the seeds? And whether or not someone takes it up, it is that active choice of taking something up, the volitional component that makes it most valuable. And children aren't ready for that commitment. However, as you're also noting that the best place to do that would be in the schools. And we have at various times, we had a program which we ran for a while, which was around the years 11 and 12, which we thought were the most significant because of the amount of pressure, the amount of demand being made on those students. And we were thinking about yoga as a way to equip them in exactly the way I've spoken today, to meet life's demands. And so we always thought years 11 and 12 were the most profound. We had difficulty getting, this is not a poke at government, but getting government to respond. Now, in reality, it's schools, busy places, teachers are struggling to just keep on top of everything. We would make representations to individual schools and at a higher level, and we found that we couldn't actually find a gateway. And yet nowadays, I know just recently in the ACT, the last couple of years now, and in many jurisdictions, now there is this component getting part of the education curriculum, which is well-being. Well-being now, I'm not an independent witness, but I would say yoga's perfect for that. We fit that well-being thing. How to be in the body, how to steady oneself, how to let go, even to lie and be still, allows you to go back into all that interaction and demands. It's certainly not something I've given up on. I agree with you. I think, as you said, the story you just outlined to me, I had known about yoga. I hadn't focused on it. And then at some point in life, often there's a point at which people start to say, now I either have the time, the inclination, changes in life, the demands, and now I can focus more. So that's one version. And then the other is, as we're saying, how can we influence, and I could even say just with the principles of yoga, a next generation or a young generation. These days, and I'm not saying anything, there's no news in this, but one of the big issues we have in many communities is diabetes. The level of diabetes, diet, and the effects of poor diet and lack of exercise as people spend more time in front of screens, and not moving and not engaging, that has tremendous effects upon people's health. Whether it's government, whether it's an individual, whether it's a family, whether a school, we do need collectively and individually to think about these questions in our life. In my life, yoga has delivered so much to me. I would say physical health, it has delivered. It has changed how I am in my body. It develops confidence. It develops, and I'll say, poise, the ability to write when things, challenges come, the ability to, we say, right the boat, to meet life's challenges. Those are not issues just for me, nor for an age group, nor for a period of time. They're actually life skills. How they're introduced, what opportunities there are to introduce them is really, sometimes it's about forces that we are not in control of. But in my life and in my history, I have always thought that yoga should be in schools or should be available to that age group. Now, that could be a long conversation, but let me finish on that question just here.
Thank you.
Alan, this is Vijay. Thank you for your presentation today. Can I ask one comment? Can I give one comment and a question based on that?
Absolutely.
Okay. The comment is, thank you for taking us back to our sutras and Gita, the way yoga we used to think, our ancestors used to think about, understanding your life fully. What, as a yoga teacher, the challenge which we are facing now, I'll just go back to the way I saw my own ancestors leading a nice farming life, having a peaceful life, and almost coming to the end of the life and saying, I have done my life beautifully. I'm going to walk away now. I know where I'm going. Such a comfortable, peaceful going away from the world. That's the way we were brought up, we were shown, we accepted it, it was nice. What happened now is that we as a yoga teacher being challenged by the modern life or the COVID which has come in and is taking the lives away. And very difficult to now convince people, look what's happening, how we now calm people down. I mean, we got our relatives in India going through all these issues, and it becomes a challenging thing to calm them down. Any views, any thoughts about that?
Well, so thanks, Vijay, for raising this issue. In simple terms, what is happening in India at the moment is a tragedy, and many in this group will be living that up close. And it is, historically, there was, and Vijay will know this, but others also, some others also, it was generally the 4 stages of life that people would live: student, householder, merchant, sannyasi. That a person's life, you travel through life, you have different roles at different times. And that when you are a student, can you be a student? Not just can you study, but can you inhabit that role to meet the challenges? And if, as a householder, can you live that life? And so, as you said, Vijay, whether it's a rural life or whether it's a city life, that view of a human life as passing through stages, I've always found very rich, because it says, don't try to be other than. If you're in a household, try to be in that, try to live that life fully. And when that ends, the classic was that you would have the sannyasi, the 4th stage of life, where you put down those responsibilities, and whether it is to change the way you live or change what you do. It does not, however, remove human suffering. And what I watch in India at the moment is the uncertainty, the inability, the fear, as you say, the fear that is there for people who are living right in the front of these questions is terrible. But it is human suffering. And to think that, well, all of us, we all suffer, But to live right up against that fear is terrible. And it's, again, if I go back to the sutras, in the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali talks about abhinivesa, and it's called fear of death. And he says that all humans at their core experience abhinivesa. And that fear can drive us at times to do things that are crazy, as people try to cling to life, to avoid the experience of abhinivesa. But in reality, what's going on in India is not about choice, and is not about something that people can remove themselves or manage. The fear of death, abhinivesa, exists for all of us. Challenge is, how do you keep, as you said, how do you find a way, if you can't remove it, if you can't remove yourself from it, how do you learn to sit with it? Now, I have not experienced, so I cannot lay claim to experience what many people in India are living through. But I have experienced fear. And in my own life, I've experienced that sense. Abhinivesa is a fear of non-existence. It's not just, I'm going to have an accident or die or catch COVID and die. It's called the fear of non-existence. And I think if we all sat here quietly, there would be a moment where you could say, I've felt some of that. Abhinivesa is one of the most profound, destabilizing experiences, emotionally, experiences that a human being can have, and yet it's there for all of us. We live with hope. Oftentimes we live as if we will be eternal, and the reality is that we are human. But how to live with that knowledge. And what I hear you highlighting is for those individuals who are living through the trauma of the event. I think all we can do is to really know what it is to suffer, to know what it is to act with compassion, and to some degree to acknowledge with them their fears, their uncertainties. We are not separate. I know we do not have the same. In Australia and in Canberra, for example, we are privileged and we are lucky. So we're not living this on the front. And yet, as human beings, you can't but have empathy with those who are directly affected. So in terms of, I have no advice, but in terms of acknowledgement, I think it's a difficult, terrible time. And at the same time, it is part of what it is to be human. To see and experience abhinivesa in one's life is not something anyone wants, and yet it's a reality.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Alan, I think you touched the point that the human suffering, we got to have understanding of that and accept that.
The word is avidya. Avidya, a lack of understanding, causes suffering. And the word vidya means knowledge or wisdom. But wisdom is not something that makes you immune. Wisdom is often to experience directly in one's own life. And of the kleshas, if I just go there a moment, of the kleshas, the afflictions or suffering noted in the sutras, Patanjali says avidya, a lack of understanding, is the source of all the others. And as you just said, that acknowledgement of suffering, that knowledge, personal knowledge of one's own suffering, I think humanizes us and gives us great compassion for others who suffer. So I agree completely.
Thank you, Alan.
Now, I think, is it true, Jayanti, we're just about, I think we're time?
Yeah, actually we are over time, but it's so interesting that I didn't want to remind anyone. If you're willing to take more questions, I am okay with that. Otherwise, yeah, we can wind down. I have given your email as well in the chat. I can do that again in the group if anyone can't find you on the net. So everyone, is it okay if we conclude now?
And if you do have a question, we'll be back again next month.
Yes, so I put that up here. So Alan has very kindly agreed to give another talk on the 19th of June, and I put it up there. So it will be on Yoga Marga, the role of practice in the path of yoga. Next week's talk is by Elena Amani. She's founder and owner of Yoga for Posture. And I think we'll get a better understanding of our posture needs by listening to her talk. And I also put it on the chat. I reiterate, Dr. Nalini Pati, many of you know him. He's a hematologist oncologist in Canberra and also a member of ORI-OZ, which is the Organization of ODIAs in Australia. He mentioned that there's a talk on physical and mental health tonight, 7 to 8 p.m. Australian time by Dr. Das and Dr. Sachdeva. So I'll send you the links on the WhatsApp group. Thank you, Alan, once again. We've got really good comments on the chat about your talk, and I'm sure we'll get many more in the WhatsApp group and by email. Very grateful to you and Robin and Vijay Arora ji.
Well, again, thank you for the invitation, and thanks for those of you here attending for your time and for making yourselves available to listen. So thank you.